It is time to begin UVing everything. We'll start with the main building first. Let's save this as a new file name. Go to File, Save As, and name it 04 UVing. We're going to assign the UV grid texture material to everything in our scene. Left click, drag and hold to marquee select all the meshes. Then right click, hold, add existing material UV grid. Press 6 to go into textured view. And we want to increase the repetition of our UV grid to a higher value. This will make it easier for us to see any stretching and the orientation of each UV shell. So open up the hypershade and double click on the UV grid texture material. This will open up Attribute Editor. Now close hypershade. Under Color, click on this icon and then click on Place 2D Texture tab up here at the top. Increase the repeat UV to 4, or you can go higher. We'll stick with 4 for now. Let's switch back to Channel Box and switch to UV Editing Workspace. As I mentioned in the previous video, I usually have the UV editor on the second monitor, but due to recording dimensions, we have to keep everything in view. So it could get a bit cluttered, but we have to work with what we have. Let's remove the UI elements here at the bottom. Go to Window, UI Elements, and disable Helpline and Command Line. This will give us just a bit extra of viewport space. We are now done with our prep work. So let's begin to UV. Select the main building and apply Automatic Unwrap. I have a custom tool shelf I'll be using, but you can access all these UV functions under UV drop-down menu. And Automatic Unwrap will do a pretty good job of unwrapping our UVs. Let's switch over to UV Component mode and drag the main building UVs outside of 0 to 1 space. Our main concern now is to establish new textile density. We will have a lot of UV shells that will need to be positioned inside the 0 to 1 space. And the UVs we did earlier for our windows, their textile density is too large. As you can see the size difference between the window frame and the window themselves. So let's fix that. I'm going to move the UVs for interior window cards next to the windows. And then select all of these UVs and scale them down. So they're a lot smaller than they were before. Then we're going to grab the new textile density from the window. So make sure you go under Transform, Tools, and Get Textile Density. This is going to be our new value. And then select all the UVs for the building and click Set. This will increase the scale of the building's UVs, but that's okay. This is a work in progress and we'll be scaling these UVs and working with the size, especially when we get to the layout stage, when we have to fit all of our UVs inside 0 to 1 space. And the reason we did not adjust the windows, the glass, and the interior space UVs to match the building is because we already laid out and adjusted the UVs for the windows, and we don't want to disrupt that. And we also had different textile density for the interior space, the geometry behind the windows. So that would have just messed everything up we already did. And making the building UVs match the windows is a lot easier because we haven't worked with the building's UVs yet. Now let's select the building and press Ctrl 1 to isolate select. We're going to begin arranging all these UV shells in a way that makes sense. So our goal is not to finalize the layout. We'll do that when we have everything UV'd. But it's to move and arrange all these shells that we can easily tell which piece, which shell belongs where. So later on, when it comes down to the final layout, we'll be able to just move shells around and place them in a way that will make it easier to texture. Let's switch over to UV Component mode. If you double click on the UV, this will select the entire UV shell. So let's select the roof, move it off to the side, and then we're going to scale the roof slightly in so it fits into the roof border. And it's okay to scale some of the shells, especially for parts which will not be seen up close. To rotate the selected UVs, I have a custom tool shelf inside the UV editor, and you can find this rotate function under Modify, Rotate. It's also available inside the UV toolkit, right here under Tools. We're going to continue to select UV shells and begin to position them, arranging them in a way that I understand what each shell is and where it belongs. Also, it's important to rotate shells so they're oriented correctly, so the numbers are facing the right direction. One of the techniques that I use is select the UV shell, and then inside the perspective viewport, press F to center on the selection. This will bring in the selection into view, so you know what that shell is, and you can see the UV grid, and then jump back into UV editor and move that shell where you need to. And this is pretty much the process that we're going to follow to complete our UVs. Automatic unwrap did a pretty good job, but there's going to be a few parts that we need to readjust, such as here on the side of the angle corner. There are two faces that should not be attached to the side of the building. So we're going to select these edges, then hold Shift, right click hold, and choose Cut. This will cut the UV along the selected edge, and then we can move these two UVs, these two shells, and position them where they need to be. I also noticed that one of these shells does not have the same textile density as the other ones. For such a small UV area of this shell, it doesn't matter, but it is something to be aware of, that it seems that automatic unwrap did not apply the same textile density across everything. Or maybe it was the projection angle of these faces, and automatic unwrap had to compensate to unwrap them properly. Either way, we're going to apply the same textile density as we have for everything else. This will also make it easier for us to stack and overlap these identical shells, and then move them into position next to the other shells where it makes sense. So we're going to continue doing this, working from larger shells that define more UV space and progressing towards smaller shells. And this does take up considerable amount of time because it is the primary main shape of our mesh. After this, it should be a lot faster because nothing takes up as much UV space as what we're working on now. And as I mentioned earlier, automatic unwrap does a very good job for hard surface architectural geometry, and it gets us 80% there. The rest of the work is fixing a few things and then arranging those shells. The UV process does get a bit tedious, especially when we get down to working with smaller shells. So it's helpful to attack the larger piece where there is most amount of work to be done first. That way we can get it out of the way. And once that's done, the rest of the process becomes a lot easier. So we have a lot of shells for the interior window frames and door frames. And we'll wait to do those at the end of this video. Right now we're keeping our focus on the front of the store, the garage, and the area with the window shutter. Here we have another part where we need to separate the UVs along an edge. So select these edges, cut them, set the same textile density to match the rest of the UVs, and then position the UV shells where they make sense to you. Let's arrange and organize this a bit better. I'm gonna move a few shells around, give a bit more space. And the next step we're gonna focus on is working with the angled, rotated shells. It's difficult to fit angled UVs into your layout because they take up too much space and they're very awkward to work with, as well as to texture. So we're going to straighten these UVs by selecting the entire shell, and under Unfold, click on Straighten Shell. This is a great function, and we're going to do this to all of our angled rotated shells. And then we're going to find out where they go, rotate 90 degrees if needed, make sure they are oriented correctly, so the direction of the numbers is projected correctly, and then arrange them within the layout. At this point, I am stacking and overlapping a few shells, so they share the same UV space and eventually the same texture, but I'm not overly concerned with optimizing too much yet. That will come a little later when we have to finalize the layout. So at this stage, I'm just going with the flow, and if the two shells seem like they should be overlapping, I stack them on top of each other and arrange them within the current layout. But the main goal here is to organize these shells and make sense of them. So here we have just a few shells left that belong to the garage door / storefront window shutter. So we're going to move them into position, and the rest of the UV shells should belong to the windows and the back doors. So I'm going to double check. Select a couple of shells at a time, and then in perspective viewport, press F to center view on selection, and check that the selected shells do in fact belong to the window frames or the back doors. That way we know that we have nothing else left that belongs to the front of the building or to the sides. And yes, all the shells that we have left do belong to the window frames and the door frames. Before we get these shells done, let's come back to our layout we already did, and there's a few things we need to fix. First is we want to separate the UV shell for the angled wall of the building. We want this piece to be separate, so we're going to select these edges and cut them. Then move them off to the side, and we need to scale them slightly because there's very small amount of stretching. Let's scale along the x-axis while looking at the UV grid and making sure it is uniform, and that looks good. Then I'm going to set the textile density to the value we have picked out, and actually what I'm going to do is select everything, all of our main building UVs, and set them all to the same textile density, just to make sure that everything is set to this value. Let's scale the roof UVs so they fit within the top UV roof border. Next, we're going to focus on something very important. We want to orient UV shells so the numbers are facing the right direction and they're not upside down or rotated 90 degrees. This will make texturing a lot easier to work with. We'll be using Quixel Dedo to texture our mesh, and in that software you're able to directly paint on the 3D mesh. So let's say we wanted to paint some dirt on top of this garage door holder, and this shell on the side, if it's upside down and we paint in this corner of the mesh, the dirt will appear at the top, but then because the UV shell is upside down and the shared edge is at the bottom and not at the top, the dirt will be painted here at the top and will continue here at the bottom due to the shared UV edge also being at the bottom. And this will become more apparent when we texture this mesh. But right now, just know that orienting all of your UV shells so they're facing the right direction will save you a lot of trouble during the texturing phase. So that is what we're gonna do here. We're gonna go through and check to make sure that all of the shells have correct orientation so the shared edges between UV shells have a consistent flow to them. And in order to catch which UV shells we need to rotate, let's increase our UV pattern grid to a higher number. So I'm going to open up Hypershade, double click on the UV grid texture material to open up Attribute Editor, then go to Color Attribute and place 2D tab. Then increase Repeat UV to 10. This will be a lot easier to spot when the UV shell is not oriented correctly. So for most of these UVs we can tell if we need to flip them, rotate them, but it's the ones that are very small, the border edges here at the garage door, at the front of the store, those are the ones that are difficult to see. And those are the ones that I'm checking. So I'm just going through and selecting the UV shell, centering the view in the perspective viewport, and then moving that shell to see if I need to rotate it. Now, whether you want to go into this fine detailing and be this precise is up to you. You know, some of these UV shells, the player's not gonna see them up close or even notice. I do want to show you how to properly do this, but then maybe if you are short on time, you are on a deadline, you could skip some of these processes and focus on more important things. So the important part that I want to show you is how to do it properly, and then once you know how to do it, you can make the decision if you want to spend the time on fine-tuning and detailing at this level, or ignore it and focus on more noticeable fixes and more important areas. And now we can begin to arrange the UV shells for window frames and the door frames. So for this, I'm going to arrange each UV shell for each window together, so that way I know where the top, the bottom, and the sides are. I am also rotating each shell so it's facing the right direction. The workflow is I'm coming up to each window, selecting the faces or the UV shells for the top, bottom, and the two sides, and then dragging these shells off to the side and arranging them so I know where the top, bottom, and the two sides are. And I'm doing this for every single window frame around the building. Then we're gonna come back through and overlap certain shells together, stack them on top of each other. But right now we just want to organize them, arrange them, and orient each shell correctly. I am doing this one window at a time, so I know that each of these shells belong to the same window frame. And then we're going to do the same thing for when we reach the door frame. Again, we're not going to overlap anything here yet. We just need to make sense of this layout. This video is probably going to be the longest one for the UVing process. The rest of the objects are much smaller and should be a lot simpler to do. Plus we covered all the background of kind of the workflow of how we're going to approach each mesh. For most of the objects we modeled, we'll be using automatic unwrap. This will get us started in the right direction, pretty much most of the time. There are a few meshes that we might use to project on X, Y, or Z axes. And then of course for the pipes, the wires, and the building light, we'll use cylindrical projection. There will also be times when we would need to cut along few selected edges to separate a single shell into multiple UV shells. And sometimes we will sew multiple UV shells into one. So again, it's going to be case by case basis. But this overall UV process is fairly simple. And it's just a handful of functions that we have to use, but we just have to repeat them over and over again, especially for such a large mesh and multiple objects that make up this final asset. And here we are. We are finally done arranging these UV shells. I'm gonna do some minor tweaking. And now we want to make better sense and organize some of these shells for UV window frames and door frames. So I want to begin positioning these UV shells so they take up less space, while still maintaining the same positioning. That way I know that the vertical shells belong to the sides and the horizontal shells belong to the top and the bottom. We also want to begin stacking or overlapping some of these UV shells, but not all of them. So any two window frames that are next to each other and in the same view, I do not want to overlap those UV shells together because the repetition might be too noticeable. So I just want to pick and choose the same window UV shells and only stack those that are not in the same view. So for example, the UVs for the two double windows in the front will not be stacked and overlapped because the texture repetition might be too noticeable. But one of them will overlap with the UVs for the double window on the side. Again, this is just a precaution to prevent the same texture appearing in the same point of view for those overlapping UVs. But as I mentioned before, this is something that may not even be noticeable. And in the end, depending on our layout and how much workable space we have, because we have a lot of UVs that we'll have to include inside 0 to 1 space, we might end up overlapping them all so they share the same texture. But we'll see. Right now we're just going with the base case scenario to prevent having the player see the visual texture repetition. But then in the end we'll have to decide the trade-off we might have to make based on our entire UV space. So again, just to reiterate, we are overlapping the same UV shells for windows that do not appear within the same viewpoint to prevent possible texture repetition. But we will come back to this layout and optimize it better when everything is done and we have to fit all of our UV shells into 0 to 1 space. Alright, let's move all of these UVs off to the side, right here. And this is going to be our temporary holding area until we get everything else UV'd. We are now done with the main building UVs. The rest of the meshes should be a lot easier and faster to do.